The Central Park had become Sarah Mitchell's place of solace, her sanctuary in the city's constant buzz. Most afternoons she could be found sitting on the same well-worn bench, under the sprawling shade of ancient oak trees, her face turned toward the gentle breeze. The symphony of chirping birds mixed with the distant laughter of children brought her a kind of peace she rarely found elsewhere. In her lap rested the sturdy leather leash of Bud, her loyal German shepherd. Bud wasn't merely a companion, he was her protector, her guide, her unwavering lifeline. After the tragic car accident that had stolen her sight 5 years ago, Bud had become everything she needed to navigate the world with confidence. But today, Bud wasn't calm. His ears twitched with every distant sound, and his sharp gaze darted across the park, scanning the surroundings as if sensing something was off. The tension in his posture made Sarah grip his leash just a little tighter, her thumb brushing over the leather's smooth edge. Right across the park, Hank McCoy leaned against his motorcycle. The man's bulky frame, shaved head, and tattoos gave him a presence that was hard to ignore. His group of leather-clad friends lounged near him, exchanging crude jokes, but Hank's attention wasn't on them. His sharp gaze had landed on Sarah, her serene demeanor, the dog's disciplined stance, and something about the sight irritated him. Flicking the cigarette in his hand to the ground, Hank sneered. "Look at that, a princess with her perfect little dog," he said, pushing off his bike. His friends chuckled as he sauntered across the park, his boots striking heavily against the pavement. Bud was the first to notice the approaching threat. The German shepherd's ears shot up, his body stiffening. A low, warning growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Sarah felt the tension through the leash and turned her head toward the heavy footsteps nearing her. "Hey there," Hank called out mockingly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Nice dog you've got. What does he do? Tricks, maybe? Can he roll over or fetch?" Sarah's grip tightened around Bud's leash, her pulse quickening. She couldn't see the man, but the malice in his voice sent a chill through her. "Leave us alone," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. Instead of backing off, Hank clapped his hands loudly, trying to provoke the dog. Bud's growl deepened, his sharp eyes locked on Hank, but he didn't move a muscle. "Aw, tough guy, huh?" Hank taunted, taking another step closer. A few passers-by had stopped, drawn in by the tension of the scene unfolding. Some whispered nervously, while others simply watched, unsure whether to intervene. Sensing the attention, Hank decided to escalate. With a smug grin, he raised his foot as if to kick Bud. "Don't you dare!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. What Hank didn't realize was that Bud wasn't an ordinary dog. Before becoming Sarah's guide, Bud had been a highly trained K9 service dog with years of military experience. His disciplined instincts were razor-sharp, capable of handling threats far greater than a bully in a park. As Hank's foot swung closer, Bud's training kicked in. With lightning speed, the German shepherd sidestepped the kick, letting out a sharp, authoritative bark that echoed through the park. The sudden movement startled Hank and he stumbled backward, his bravado briefly faltering. In a flash, Bud moved between Sarah and the man, his teeth bared and his body coiled like a spring ready to strike. His unwavering focus made it clear to everyone present, this was no ordinary dog. The park grew silent. A small crowd had gathered now, their phones held up to capture the confrontation. "Someone should stop him," a woman whispered anxiously, but no one stepped forward. Sarah could feel the change in the air, the electric tension, Bud's readiness. "Bud," she whispered shakily, unsure of what was happening but knowing her dog was protecting her. Hank's earlier sneer returned, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Defend himself?" he mocked, stepping closer again. "He's just a dog." But before Hank could get any closer, Bud's low growl became a deep, thunderous snarl that froze the man in place. For the first time, fear flashed across Hank's face as he realized this dog was no ordinary pet. Still, he raised his hands mockingly. "What's your dog gonna do, huh? I'm not scared." Bud lunged forward just slightly, barking so ferociously that Hank jumped back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The crowd gasped, the tension breaking momentarily into murmurs of awe and disbelief. "Back off!" Sarah shouted again, her voice shaking but firm. The standoff continued for a moment longer, but Hank's confidence was gone. He turned to his friends, waving them off as if the entire encounter hadn't rattled him. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice lacking the bravado it held earlier. As they walked away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, some applauding quietly while others muttered about calling the authorities. Bud didn't relax until the men were completely out of sight. his body gradually eased, though his ears remained alert. Sarah knelt beside him, running a trembling hand over his head. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Bud leaned into her touch, his loyalty and training shining through. The park was still again, but the moment lingered in the air. For Sarah and Bud, it was more than a confrontation, it was a reminder of the strength they carried together. Hank was no longer grinning. His earlier bravado had been stripped away, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. He muttered under his breath, his voice losing its earlier mocking tone. "What the hell is this dog's problem?" His gaze darted nervously toward Bud, who stood like a stone sentinel, growling low and steady. Around them, the murmuring crowd grew larger, phones raised to capture the scene unfolding before them. Whispers of confusion and outrage filled the air, but no one dared to intervene. At least not yet. Just then, a man in a park ranger uniform pushed through the gathering. His tall frame and sharp expression immediately commanded attention. "What's going on here?" the ranger demanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Hank froze. The swagger he had worn moments before vanished as he realized he was now the center of unwanted attention. His confident stance faltered and his hands raised instinctively, palms out, as if to downplay his actions. "Relax, I was just messing around," he mumbled, though his voice lacked conviction. The dog overreacted. The park ranger stepped between Hank and Sarah, his posture firm and unyielding. "Messing around?" he repeated, disbelief coloring his tone. "You call threatening a guide dog messing around? That's not just reckless, it's illegal." Sarah tightened her grip on Bud's leash, her knuckles white. Though her body still trembled, she could feel Bud's strength radiating through the leather strap. He remained planted firmly in front of her, his gaze locked onto Hank. The low rumble of his growl hadn't ceased, and it was clear to anyone watching that the German Shepherd wasn't about to back down. The ranger didn't waver. His tone was steady but biting as he continued. "This dog is doing his job, protecting her, and by the looks of it, he's far better at his job than you are at being a decent human being." Hank's smirk, now barely a shadow of its former self, vanished entirely as the ranger's words hit him squarely. His shoulders slumped slightly, his eyes darting toward the crowd. The murmurs had grown louder, and every phone pointed at him only added to the weight of judgment pressing down on him. Sarah reached down, her trembling fingers brushing over Bud's fur. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice quivering but filled with gratitude. The scene might have ended there, but an older man wearing a weathered military cap stepped forward. His slow, deliberate movements carried a quiet authority that immediately drew attention. His voice cut through the whispers, calm but firm. "That's no ordinary dog," the man said, his gaze fixed on Bud with a mixture of respect and recognition. The crowd collectively held its breath, their eyes darting between the man, the dog, and the increasingly uncomfortable Hank. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing as she instinctively clutched Bud's leash tighter. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The man nodded, stepping closer. "He might be your guide dog now, ma'am, but I'd bet my last dollar that he served before that. That stance, that bark? Those are instincts you only see in trained military dogs. That dog's a K9. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and even Hank blinked in surprise, his bravado cracking further. Sarah's mouth parted slightly, her hand instinctively moving to Bud's head. She crouched beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "Bud," she murmured, her voice trembling as a wave of awe and disbelief washed over her. The older man nodded slowly, his expression unwavering. Dogs like him are heroes. They're trained for combat zones, to protect soldiers, to neutralize threats. If he's reacting like this, it's because he sees that man as a danger. His sharp gaze shifted to Hank, who took another cautious step back, his earlier confidence crumbling like a house of cards. "I didn't know," Hank muttered, his voice barely audible. The park ranger stepped forward, his expression one of unyielding authority. "Ignorance doesn't excuse your actions. You're lucky this dog showed restraint. I've seen dogs like him in action. They don't give warnings twice." Bud's growl softened, but his posture remained alert, his watchful eyes fixed on Hank, ensuring the man didn't try anything else. Sarah exhaled shakily, her heart pounding in her chest as she processed what she had just learned. To the crowd, Bud wasn't just a guide dog anymore. He was a warrior, a protector whose loyalty went beyond mere training. "You're done here," the ranger barked, gesturing for Hank to leave. But Hank hesitated, his gaze flickering between Bud the ranger and the older man. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, with someone shouting, "Call the cops!" Hank cursed under his breath, realizing there was no way out of this without facing consequences. He turned on his heel and began walking away, his shoulders slumped and his earlier arrogance completely drained. The crowd buzzed with awe as they watched him retreat. Bud, though slightly more relaxed, didn't move until Hank disappeared from view. Only then did his body ease completely, the tension melting away like a coiled spring finally unwinding. Sarah leaned against the bench, her hand resting on Bud's head. "Good boy," she whispered again, her voice thick with emotion. Bud nuzzled her hand in response, his quiet strength grounding her in the moment. The ranger turned to Sarah, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her voice was still shaky. "I think so, thank you." The older man with the military cap lingered for a moment, tipping his hat to Bud before walking away. "That dog saved your life today," he said over his shoulder. "Take good care of him." "I will," Sarah murmured, brushing a tear from her cheek as she hugged Bud close. The park slowly returned to its usual hum of activity, but for Sarah, nothing would be the same again. Bud wasn't just her guide dog, he was her guardian, her hero, and her lifeline, in every sense of the word. Sarah's thoughts spiraled as if the world had tilted on its axis. Bud, a military dog? The older man's words echoed in her mind. Combat zones, soldiers, threats. She crouched down beside Bud, her fingers trembling as they combed through his fur. "Bud!" she whispered softly, her voice catching as if she were trying to reach a part of him she'd never truly understood. Bud turned his head slightly, his intelligent eyes softening for just a moment before refocusing on Hank. His unwavering loyalty sent a surge of emotion crashing over her. Who was this dog that she had trusted with her life for years? The older man stepped forward again, his expression both serious and kind. "Ma'am, dogs like him don't just forget their training, it's buried deep, waiting for a moment when they're needed. Today, he thought you needed him." Sarah swallowed hard, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She thought back to all the moments Bud had acted unusually alert or protective, the times his bark had stopped her in her tracks or his growls had made her pause. She had always seen him as her guide, but now, she realized he had been so much more all along. Meanwhile, Hank shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the air too much for him to bear. All right, he muttered, backing away. "I didn't mean any harm." The park ranger wasn't convinced, his voice was sharp and unyielding. "That's not for you to decide, you've already done enough." Hank turned toward the exit, his shoulders hunched as the ranger followed close behind to ensure he didn't return. The crowd began to thin, though a few lingered, their eyes still fixed on Sarah and Bud with newfound awe. The older man remained as well, his gaze resting on Bud with a deep respect that spoke volumes. When the last murmurs faded and the park fell quiet again, Sarah stayed seated on the bench, her hand resting gently on Bud's back. "You've always been my protector," she murmured, her voice cracking slightly, "but I never knew how far you'd go for me." Bud sat beside her, calm and steady now, his sharp eyes scanning the park as though ensuring the danger had passed. For Sarah, the park no longer felt like a peaceful retreat. It was now the place where she had uncovered a truth she never expected, one that would forever change how she saw Bud and, perhaps, herself. That evening, Sarah sat on the edge of her small couch, staring at Bud as he rested near her feet. The day's events replayed in her mind like a whirlwind. Hank's aggression, the park ranger's intervention, and, most of all, the revelation about Bud's past. She reached for her laptop, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keys. Where would she even start? What would she search for? Eventually the words military K9 history came to mind. She typed them in and began to read. Article after article, story after story, her understanding of Bud deepened with every word. These dogs weren't just trained companions, they were soldiers in every sense. They were taught to detect threats, protect their handlers, and stay calm under immense pressure. Every detail fit perfectly with how Bud had acted that day. But the new understanding also brought questions. What had Bud been through? Who had he served with? And why had he ended up with her? The thought of him risking his life in dangerous faraway places stirred both pride and sadness in Sarah's heart. She closed the laptop and slid onto the floor, sitting beside Bud. Her fingers ran gently through his thick fur as she spoke softly. "I've always trusted you, Bud, but now I understand why. You're so much more than I ever realized. You've been through so much, haven't you?" Bud's ears twitched at the sound of her voice and he leaned into her touch. For the first time, Sarah felt their bond deepen in a way that went beyond dependence. It was a connection forged by Bud's quiet strength, resilience, and unwavering loyalty. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She called the local veterans organization, explaining what had happened and asking if there was any way to learn more about Bud's history. The woman on the other end of the line listened intently and promised to look into it. Many retired canines are placed in new roles like guiding or therapy, the woman explained. It's a way to give them purpose after their service. The word purpose carried new weight for Sarah. Bud hadn't just been assigned to her to guide her through life, he had been saving her in ways she hadn't even comprehended. As the call ended, Sarah knelt down beside Bud again, resting her forehead against his. "We'll figure it out together," she said with a small, genuine smile. Bud wagged his tail lightly, his calm demeanor radiating comfort and reassurance. For Sarah, one thing had become clear. Bud wasn't just her guide dog, he was her guardian, her partner, and her hero. A week had passed since the unsettling encounter in the park, but Sarah's thoughts remained tethered to the older man's words. "That's a canine, he's trained for combat." Bud had always been special to her, but now she understood just how little she truly knew about him. She relied on his steady presence and guidance every day, yet there was an entire life he had lived before they met, one filled with experiences she could hardly imagine. One afternoon, as she prepared to take Bud for their usual walk, her phone buzzed. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but Sarah answered quickly, her heart beating a little faster than usual. "Miss Mitchell, this is Karen from the Veterans Organization," said a calm voice on the other end. "Yes, this is Sarah," she replied, her voice a little shaky as she gripped the phone tightly. "I found some information about your dog," Karen continued. Sarah held her breath as Karen explained. "Your dog's military ID matches a retired canine named Bravo. He served overseas alongside a handler, Sergeant Jake Carter. They were deployed on multiple missions before Bravo retired." Hearing Bud referred to as Bravo sent a chill through Sarah. The name carried weight, a history she couldn't yet fathom. "Bravo," she repeated softly, the name tasting foreign on her tongue. Karen continued, "Sergeant Carter retired a few years ago and now lives in Montana. If you'd like, I can provide his contact information. He might be able to tell you more about Bravo's service." Sarah jotted down the details, her hand trembling slightly as she thanked Karen and ended the call. Looking down at Bud, who lay at her feet with his head resting calmly on his paws, she whispered, "Bravo." The sound of the name made Bud's ears twitch, but he remained still, his steady presence anchoring her as questions swirled in her mind. What kind of life had he lived before becoming her guide dog? That evening, Sarah sat on her couch with her phone clutched in her hands, her nerves frayed as she stared at the number Karen had given her. She had rehearsed her words countless times but found herself paralyzed by anxiety. What if reaching out reopened painful memories for Sergeant Carter? What if he didn't want to talk about Bravo? Her gaze drifted to Bud, who rested by her feet, his calm demeanor reminding her of the many times he had been her source of courage. She owed it to him to uncover the pieces of his story, no matter how difficult it might be. Summoning her resolve, Sarah pressed the call button. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Hello." The sound made Sarah's nerves spike, but she steadied herself. "Hi, is this Sergeant Jake Carter? My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I think I have your former canine, Bravo." There was a long pause, so quiet that Sarah wondered if the line had gone dead, but then Jake's voice returned, heavy with emotion. "Bravo? Are you serious? I thought I'd never hear anything about him again." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she heard the raw emotion in Jake's voice. "He's been with me for a few years now," she said, softly. "I had no idea about his past until recently. He's saved my life in ways I can't even explain." Jake let out a shaky breath. "He saved mine too, more times than I can count. I need to see him." At that moment, Sarah realized this was not just a chance to uncover Bud's past, it was the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. The days following Sarah's call with Sergeant Jake Carter felt like an eternity. Jake had insisted on flying out immediately to see Bravo. The anticipation filled Sarah's small apartment with a nervous energy that even Bud seemed to sense. Would Bud remember Jake? Would this meeting change the bond she and Bud shared? These questions churned in her mind as she prepared for the emotional day ahead. On the afternoon of Jake's arrival, Sarah waited with Bud outside her apartment. She could feel the leash trembling slightly in her hands as Bud shifted his weight, mirroring her unease. "It's gonna be okay, Bud," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the reassurance was meant for him or herself. A car pulled up, and Sarah heard the sound of a door slamming shut. Moments later, a deep voice greeted her. Sarah? Yes, that's me, she said nervously, smiling as she gestured toward Bud. Her voice caught slightly as she added, "And this is Bravo." At the sound of his old name, Bud's ears perked up. Jake froze in place, his eyes locking onto the dog. Slowly, he crouched down and extended a hand. "Hey there, boy," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "Do you remember me?" Bud stood still, his body tense. Sarah held her breath, the moments stretching endlessly. Then, almost imperceptibly, Bud took a cautious step forward, sniffing Jake's outstretched hand. The shift was gradual but unmistakable. Bud's tail began to wag, first tentatively and then with growing enthusiasm. A low, familiar whine escaped his throat, and Jake's eyes filled with tears. "You remember, don't you?" Jake whispered, his hand gently stroking Bud's head. Sarah's own eyes brimmed with tears as she witnessed the connection between the two. She had always known Bud was special, but seeing this reunion brought a new depth to that understanding. This wasn't just about Bud's past, it was about the bonds he had formed and the lives he had touched, hers included. For Sarah, the day felt like both a revelation and a gift. As the three of them moved into Sarah's cozy apartment, Jake began sharing stories of his time with Bravo in the military. "Bravo was my partner on every mission," he said, his voice filled with pride. "He saved my life more times than I can count. He was fearless, always first into danger, always making sure we made it back." Sarah listened intently, her fingers gently brushing Bud's fur as Jake recounted their bond. The stories were harrowing, intense combat missions, split-second decisions, and moments where Bravo's instincts had made the difference between life and death. Jake's tone was filled with both reverence and gratitude, each word a testament to the profound connection he had shared with the dog now lying calmly at Sarah's feet. That evening, as Jake prepared to leave, he knelt down beside Bud one last time. His strong hands rested on the dog's head, his expression softened by emotion. "You've got a good life now, boy," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "I couldn't have asked for a better person to take care of you." Sarah felt her chest tighten, her throat constricting with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me with him," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Jake stood slowly, giving her a small but sincere smile. "He's in the right place," he said simply. As Jake walked out the door, Sarah looked down at Bud. She ran her hand gently over his fur, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had learned about him. "You've been through so much," she murmured, "but no matter what, you're home now." In the days that followed Jake's visit, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about everything she had learned. The stories of Bud's bravery in combat, his quick thinking under pressure, and his unwavering loyalty painted a picture of a dog who had lived through more than most humans could fathom. Every time she held his leash or felt him guide her across the street, she thought about the scars, visible or invisible, that he might carry from his past. One afternoon, Sarah decided to take Bud to a quieter part of the park, a place she had avoided since the encounter with Hank. The memory of that day still lingered, but now it felt different. She no longer saw Bud as just her guide dog. She saw him as a protector, a warrior who had chosen to give her his trust. As they walked along the path, Sarah spoke softly to Bud. "I hope you know how much you mean to me," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "You've done so much for so many people, and yet you still choose to be by my side every day." Bud responded with a gentle nudge against her leg, his way of reassuring her. Sarah smiled, sitting down on a bench and letting him rest at her feet. The park was quiet, the rustling of leaves in the breeze creating a soothing backdrop. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of peace. Her thoughts drifted back to something Jake had said during his visit. "He doesn't forget his training. It's always there, just waiting." She wondered if Bud ever missed that life, the adrenaline, the danger, the constant sense of purpose. Later that evening, unable to shake the questions, Sarah decided to call Jake again. As the phone rang, she rehearsed her words in her head, her nerves fluttering in her chest. When Jake picked up, his voice was warm and familiar. "Jake," Sarah began, "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me. Do you think Bravo, ever misses his old life?" There was a pause on the other end before Jake replied, his tone thoughtful. "He might, in his own way," he said. "But dogs like him don't live in the past. They live for their people. And right now, Sarah, you're his mission." Those words stayed with her long after the call ended. You're his mission. Sarah had always seen Bud as her lifeline, the one who helped her navigate a world she couldn't see, but now she realized their bond was deeper than dependence. It was mutual. She had given Bud a purpose, just as he had given her the confidence to live her life again. It was a partnership in every sense of the word. That night Sarah sat on the floor beside Bud, her hand resting gently on his back. She leaned in close, her voice soft but resolute. "I'll make sure you know how much you're loved, Bud, every single day." Bud leaned into her, his warm presence grounding her in the moment. For Sarah there was no greater comfort than knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself settling into a deeper understanding of her bond with Bud. Knowing his past didn't change their relationship, it enhanced it. Each time he guided her across the street or nudged her away from danger, she thought about the battles he had fought, both in combat and in adapting to his new life. But one lingering thought kept her awake at night. Was she truly giving him the life he deserved? One morning, while sipping her coffee, Sarah came across an article about retired military dogs. It described how many K9s struggled to adjust after leaving the field. Without the intense structure of their training, some dogs became restless, or even depressed, longing for the sense of purpose they once had. Sarah set her coffee mug down, her thoughts swirling. Bud had been her rock, her protector, her everything, but was she giving him what he needed in return? As she looked down at Bud lying peacefully by her feet, she resolved to find new ways to honor his past and ensure his happiness. He had given her so much, it was time for her to give back. Sarah looked down at Bud, who lay peacefully at her feet. The warm glow of the room wrapped around them like a cocoon, but Sarah's mind was far from still. Every detail of Bud's past, the revelations about his service, the stories Jake had shared, and the incredible bond they now shared, played on a loop in her thoughts. Bud shifted slightly, his ears twitching at a faint noise outside, his ever-vigilant nature showing even in the stillness. Sarah reached down, running her fingers gently through his fur, the texture grounding her in the moment. "You've seen so much, haven't you?" she whispered, her voice soft yet filled with emotion. "And yet, after everything, you've chosen to be here with me." As she spoke, her heart swelled with gratitude. Bud wasn't just a guide dog or even a retired soldier. He was her protector, her partner, and her closest friend. Their journey together had started with her leaning on him for support, but now she saw the deeper truth. They leaned on each other. The weeks following their first trip to the training facility had brought new life to both of them. Every Saturday, Bud came alive as he navigated the obstacle courses, worked on tracking, and displayed the skills he had honed in his earlier life. Watching him move with such purpose filled Sarah with pride. It was clear that these sessions weren't just activities for Bud, they were a reminder of who he had been and who he still was. But as much as Bud thrived in those moments, Sarah noticed something else too. Whenever they finished and returned home, Bud would always gravitate toward her, his calm presence a testament to his loyalty. It was as if he was saying, "No matter what, you are my home now." One quiet evening, after a particularly long day, Sarah found herself sitting on the floor beside Bud. Her hand rested on his side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to give back to you as much as you've given me," she said softly, "but I'll try, every single day. You've done so much for me, and I'll never take you for granted." Bud's tail thumped gently against the floor, his silent way of letting her know that he understood. One Saturday, as Sarah and Bud arrived at the training center, the trainer met them with a smile that was equal parts admiration and curiosity. "You know," she began as Bud eagerly moved toward the field, "I've been working with retired K9s for years, but Bud, or Bravo, is something else. It's not just his skills, it's his heart. He's got this connection to you that I've rarely seen." Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion. "He's more than a guide dog," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's my everything." The trainer nodded, watching as Bud navigated the field with precision. "You've given him a new mission, Sarah. Dogs like him, they need a purpose, and you're it." The words stayed with Sarah as she watched Bud complete another flawless run. She had always thought of herself as the one who depended on Bud, but now she realized how much he depended on her, too. They weren't just a team, they were partners, each fulfilling a role that gave the other meaning. Later that evening, Sarah and Bud returned to their favorite bench in the park. The air was cool and the stars above twinkled faintly, a gentle reminder of how vast the world was. Sarah sat down, feeling the familiar weight of Bud leaning against her leg. "This is where it all started," she said, her voice carrying both reflection and gratitude. "That day with Hank, I thought it was just another challenge, but it was so much more. It showed me who you are, Bud, not just my guide but my guardian, my hero." Bud's ears twitched at her voice and he let out a soft huff as if to acknowledge her words. Sarah smiled, her hand resting on his head. "I don't know what I did to deserve you. but I promise to keep showing you how much you mean to me." As they sat together, the gentle hum of life around them, distant laughter, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bark of another dog, felt like a soundtrack to their journey. Sarah knew their story wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more discoveries, and more moments of quiet connection. But, whatever lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: they would face it together. Bud's quiet strength was her anchor, and her love for him was her guiding light. Together they had built a life that honored the past while embracing the future, a partnership that transcended words. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Tell us about the incredible bonds you've witnessed or experienced with your own fairy friends, and for more inspiring stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Until next time.